Hi, my name is June White, and this is my secondary sources video. Now, to give some background for my sources, my research proposal analyzes the current diplomatic environment that surrounds the repression of 1 million Muslims of the Uyghur minority in China since 2014. Through a comparison of the response to the Uyghur crisis with that of another persecuted population, I am bringing forth the argument that intervention in the human rights crisis in Xinjiang remains disproportionate, and that ultimately the international community has prioritized strategic and economic interests over human rights, which is hindering progress on this critical issue. Now, for my first secondary source, it's from CSIS, and it's titled Addressing Forced Labor in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region Toward a Shared Agenda. And I found this source, it's from the Center for Strategic International Studies, a DC-based think tank, and it's written by Amy K. Lair, who is a senior associate with the Human Rights Initiative, but she guest wrote this article on CSIS. Now, this secondary source, what type is it? Well, it's a brief that's written on the issue of forced labor of ethnic and religious minorities in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which the author contextualizes as part of a broader pattern of severe human rights abuses, which she also categorizes as a significant and growing concern that demands the attention not only of governments, but also private sector actors across the world as supply chains incorporate this forced labor. She incorporates data of supply chain analysis, legislative and policy data, corporate trade data, and she also discusses human rights reports and NGO research and combines these case studies with actions of government and customs enforcement actions to give a fuller picture of the entire situation. Now, information that can be derived from these sources and why it's important. The CSIS report and its analyses give insight into the multifaceted nature of this crisis, from economic to legal to political the political dimensions of the forced labor that's occurring in Xinjiang, because it's clearly not just a cut and dry human rights issue. It's influenced by lots of different factors, both domestically within China, but also internationally. Now, this essay discusses first the economic integration with the forced labor and how important this forced labor is to international supply chains. It uses data to show how global industries that make up so much of this international economy that we engage in as consumers are inadvertently complicit in all of these human rights abuses. It also discusses possible and potential legal and policy resources and responses to the presence of forced labor in international trade, and how legislation that is currently in place is not actually enforced, and that there's so many other potential avenues for legislation and policies, whether it's like domestically in maybe Western countries and how we respond to China, or it's in like international governing bodies like the UN or the World Trade Organization, and how power can be leveraged in those avenues. And finally, this report also uses human rights documentation and NGO research to add lots of credibility to its claims, which is something that I hope to do in my paper as well. Now, for the last question, how do I intend to use these sources to support my argument in my research paper? Well, with the analysis of forced labor and global supply chains, the paper is highlighting the culpability of the international community, which is not only ignoring the human rights crisis in Xinjiang, but it's also kind of an endorsement with our dollars, because we're endorsing the persecution by engaging in these global supply chains that have lots of roots in the forced labor. This paper also expounds on the lack of legislation around the issue and the gaps that do exist with the limited legislation that is out on the issue. This examination, I think, will bolster my argument because I want to show that the efforts that have been taking place are not enough, and that the barrier for entry on this issue for the international community is so low because there's so many policy perspectives and options that can actually begin to address this topic. We're just not engaging with them out of convenience, and because of those geopolitical and economic interests that I mentioned. In my research paper, I too intend to use the human rights documentation that the author of this paper utilizes, amongst others, to kind of link these arguments and add credibility to my own claims that the forced labor and state oppression of the Uyghurs is not just like these isolated incidents, but is of a larger systematic trend of persecution. And this is super important because as part of my, I think something that's foundational to the research that I'm doing is not only proving that this persecution is going on, which I do think the international community believes, but also proving that nothing's being done about it. And so those two ideas kind of go hand in hand into kind of the thinking behind my thesis. Now for my second source, it's titled China's Influence on the Global Human Rights System. This is a fascinating report by the Brookings Institution, and I found this source on the Brookings Institution website. It's written by Sophie Richardson, who is the China director at Human Rights Watch, and she wrote it for the Brookings Institute, which is another DC-based, very reputable think tank that analyzes policy. Now, the type of source that it is that this is actually a research paper that provides an analytical view and scholarly analysis of China's influence on global human rights systems, and uses lots of primary sources and expert interpretations to provide a well-rounded description of the issue. Now, the information that I think that I can derive from this source and why it's important. Now, overall, this article gives insight into the methods that China uses to influence international human rights mechanisms. For example, China tends to promote resolutions in other international human rights matters that emphasize state sovereignty and non-interference by foreign counterparts. This is important because it shows how China deflects criticism of its own abysmal human rights record, especially in the case of the Uyghur minority, as it endeavors to shape global human rights diplomacy and discussions in a way that prioritizes economic development over individual human rights. Now, how I intend to use this source to support my argument in my paper, I intend to argue that the international community's response to the Uyghur crisis is disproportionate and prioritizes economic interests in the exact way that China's playbook on international human rights crises depicts and how China wants these things to go down. It does so by demonstrating the diplomatic influence that China exerts in international governing and diplomatic bodies so that China can shield itself from criticism and any real action on the issue. It's almost kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like if this is pushed on other international crises, then it can be used to justify the domestic peril within China that's going on in this region. China's diplomatic strategies on this issue have been overwhelmingly successful in silencing international response to the crisis. This failure of the international response is not only apparent in this context, but also gives, it's also a clear surrender of geopolitical power and actually gives the upper hand to China in the international sphere. So when I'm arguing, the United States is not engaging, and the United States, amongst many other international bodies, when they are choosing not to engage with China because of geopolitical and economic interests, they're actually playing right into the Chinese handbook. So by trying to maintain status in these economic issues, the United States is ultimately ceding hegemonic power in the global power balance to China by doing exactly what China wants. Now, this source also demonstrates how and why countries are so reluctant to get involved in the crisis, which directly ties to my argument that not enough is being done on the issue. As China succeeds in redefining these human rights norms, as previously evidenced in the primary source that I mentioned in my last video, the white papers, countries fear political and economic repercussions that ultimately are leaving the Uyghurs in continued perpetual jeopardy with no real solution being offered. Now, the comparative analysis in this article can also be used in tandem with sources that display international responses to human rights violations, and this all highlights the inconsistencies and the impact that geopolitical considerations have had on humanitarian interventions in Xinjiang. Overall, this source can impact my research by substantiating claims that the international community response to the Uyghur has been tepid at best and glaringly neglectful at worst, as this influence of strategic and economic interests shape human rights diplomacy in a way that's incredibly convenient and supportive to Chinese interests.